in the Tower by E.F. Benson, published in 1912. I was 16 when I first had the dream. It always begins with me standing at the door of a large red brick house where, I understand, I am going to stay. A servant opens the door and tells me that tea is being served in the garden. He leads me through a dark paneled hall with a large fireplace, and then out onto a cheerful green lawn set round with flower beds. A few people sit at the tea table, but they're all strangers to me except one, a schoolfellow named Jack Stone. He is clearly the son of the house and introduces me to his mother and father and two sisters. The afternoon is hot, and an intolerable oppression hangs in the air. Along the far side of the lawn runs a red brick wall with an iron gate in its center, and just beyond the gate stands a walnut tree. We sit in the shadow of the house, opposite a row of long windows, and at one end of the house stands a tower of 3 stories. The tower looks much older than the rest of the building. The entire party sits in absolute silence for a while. Eventually, Mrs. Stone breaks the silence and speaks to me. "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Somehow, I already knew that I would have the room in the tower and that it would contain something dreadful. Jack gets up immediately, and I understand that I must follow him. In silence, we pass through the hall and mount a great oak staircase with many corners. We arrive at a small landing with 2 doors. He opens one of these for me to enter, and without coming in himself, closes it after me. Then I know with complete certainty that something awful is in the room. And with the horror of nightmare growing swiftly within me, I awake in a spasm of terror. Variations of this dream occurred to me intermittently for 15 years. Most often it came in exactly this form: the arrival, the tea laid out on the lawn, the deadly silence followed by those 2 deadly sentences, the mounting of the oak staircase leading up to the room in the tower. And it always came to an end in the nightmare of terror at whatever was in the room, though I never saw what it was. In one variation of the dream, we would be having dinner in the dining room of the house instead of tea on the lawn. But wherever we were, there was the same silence, and the same sense of dreadful foreboding. And I knew the silence would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." In another variation, I would find myself playing cards in absolute silence in a drawing room lit with immense chandeliers. What the game was, I had no idea. And even though the room was well lit by chandeliers, I was scarcely able to see the cards. And with a sense of frightening anticipation, I knew that soon Mrs. Stone would get up and say to me, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." As this dream continued to recur, curious developments took place in the characters within the dream. Things would happen to them as might happen to living persons. For example, Mrs. Stone had black hair when I first saw her. Over time, she became gray, and instead of rising briskly from the table, as she had done at first, she got up very feebly, as if the strength was leaving her limbs. Jack also grew up, and became a rather ill-looking young man. One of the sisters ceased to appear, and I understood that she had married and moved away. Then 6 months went by without a recurrence of the dream, and I began to hope that it was gone for good. But one night, after this interval, I again found myself being led out onto the lawn for tea. But this time, Mrs. Stone was not there, and the others were all dressed in black. At once I guessed the reason, and my heart leapt at the thought that perhaps this time I wouldn't have to sleep in the room in the tower. As usual, we sat in silence. Then the silence was suddenly broken by a voice which I knew all too well. The voice of Mrs. Stone. As usual, she said to me, "Jack will show you to your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Her voice came from somewhere near the iron gate in the red brick wall that bounded the lawn. I looked up and saw gravestones standing just outside the gate, and I could read the lettering on the grave nearest me. It read, "In evil memory of Julia Stone." As usual, Jack got up, and again I followed him through the hall and up the oak staircase. This time it was darker than usual, and there was a dreadful odor of decay in the room. I awoke from the dream, screaming. This dream, and the variations I've mentioned, went on at intervals for 15 years, as I said. Sometimes I dreamed it 2 or 3 nights in succession, but on average I would say I dreamed it maybe once a month. It always ended in the same appalling terror, and it seemed to gather fresh fear with each recurrence. The characters in the dream grew older over time. Some died, others married. And after Mrs. Stone had died in the dream, I never saw her again. But it was always her voice that told me that I would have the room in the tower, and I could always see her gravestone standing just outside the gate. Then one summer, something astounding happened. I went to stay with a friend, John Clifton, who had taken a summer house in Sussex. John met me at the train station with his motor car. We spent the day playing golf, and then late in the afternoon, we drove about 10 miles to his house. As we drove, the weather changed, became very stagnant and oppressive. I had that sense of apprehension one feels just before a thunderstorm. I fell asleep in the car and awoke only when the motor stopped. With a sudden mix of fear and curiosity, I found myself looking at the house from my dream. As we entered the doorway, I was half wondering whether I was dreaming again. We went through a oak-paneled hall and then out onto a lawn where tea was laid in the shadow of the house. The lawn was set round with flower beds and bounded on one side by a red brick wall with an iron gate in its center. Just beyond the gate stood a walnut tree. The facade of the house was very long, and at one end stood a tower of 3 stories. The tower looked much older than the rest of the building. Here, for the moment, all resemblance to the dream ceased. There was no silent and terrible family. Instead, there was a large assembly of cheerful people, all of whom I knew. And in spite of the horror of the dream, I remained calm, though I was intensely curious about what would happen next. Tea was pleasant, and before long, Mrs. Clifton got up. And at that moment, I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me. "Jack will show you to your room. I've given you the room in the tower." For a second, the horror of the dream took hold of me again. But it quickly passed, and once more I felt only the most intense curiosity. John turned to me and said, "It's right up at the top of the house. We're absolutely full up. Would you like to go up and see it now?" I got up and followed him. In silence, we passed through the hall and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door, and I entered the room. And at that moment, sheer irrational terror consumed me. I didn't know what I feared. I simply feared. Then, like a sudden recollection, I knew what I feared. I feared Mrs. Stone, whose grave I had seen so often in my dream. The grave with the sinister inscription, "In evil memory." The grave just beyond the lawn that now lay below my window. Then once more, the fear was gone. I looked around the room and found that nothing had been changed from the room in my dream, which I knew so well. The bed along the wall, the fireplace, the small bookcase, the 2 lattice-pane windows, and the dressing table. My luggage had already been unpacked, and my dinner clothes were spread out on the bed. Then I saw something that I had never seen in any of my dreams. A life-sized oil painting of Mrs. Stone. It hung beside the bed. As I looked at the painting, I was seized once more by the horror of nightmare. The painting represented Mrs. Stone as I had seen her last in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired. But in spite of her withered body, her narrow eyes beamed with unimaginable evil. The whole face exuded some appalling mirth. Then there was a tap at the door, and I nearly jumped. John Clifton entered. "Got everything you want?" "Rather more than I want," I said, pointing to the painting. He laughed. "Yes, it is rather unpleasant, isn't it? I can imagine getting a nightmare if I went to sleep with that by my bed. I can have it removed if you like." I replied, "I really wish you would." He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant, we removed the painting, carried it onto the landing, and put it with its face to the wall. After dinner, the heat and oppression of the air increased noticeably. For some time, most of the party, including John Clifton and myself, sat outside on the lawn where we had had tea. The sky was absolutely dark. Our assembly gradually thinned as some went up to bed and others dispersed to the smoking room. By 11 o'clock, my host and I were the only 2 left. John stood up and said, "Now you'll see something rather odd." His dog, an Irish terrier, had come out of the house as we talked. The door behind us was open, and light from the house shone across the lawn, up to the iron gate, and beyond to the walnut tree. The dog was growling as if he was ready to spring at something. He raced across the lawn up to the iron gate and stood there for a moment, staring through the bars, still growling. Then he suddenly lost his courage, gave one long howl, and scuttled back to the house. John explained, "He does this a few times a day. It's as if he sees something that he both hates and fears." We turned back toward the house, just as it began to rain. As I went to bed, the last thing I looked at before putting out the candle was the empty space on the wall next to my bed where the portrait had been. Most of the wallpaper had faded, but the space where the portrait had been was still its original dark red. I blew out the candle and fell asleep. I awoke suddenly in the middle of the night and sat bolt upright in bed. It was absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room I had dreaded in my dreams. But no horror from my dreams approached the fear that now invaded my body. Thunder crackled just above the house, and my heart was racing. But I knew I wasn't awakened by a flash of lightning. I knew something was in the room. Instinctively, I put out my right hand to keep it away. My hand was near the wall, and my fingers felt the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood beside it, and I heard the candle and matches clatter to the floor. But for the moment, there was no need of light, for a blinding flash of lightning showed me what was hanging next to my bed. The painting of Mrs. Stone. The room instantly went dark again, but in that flash, I also saw a figure leaning over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mold. And the face was the same as the face in the painting. Thunder cracked and roared overhead, and when it ceased, the night became deathly still. I heard the rustle of movement coming near me, and an odor of decaying flesh filled the room. I was frozen with fear. Then I felt a hand touching the side of my neck, and beside my ear I heard very quick breathing. And then a familiar voice spoke to me. I knew you would come to the room in the tower. I have been waiting for you, waiting for a long time. And at last you have come. Tonight I shall feast, and before long we shall feast together. The quick breathing came closer. I could feel it on my neck. At that moment, the terror that had paralyzed me gave way to the fierce instinct of self-preservation. I swung wildly with both arms and then heard a little squeal. Something dropped beside me with a thud. I took a few steps, nearly tripping over whatever it was. By sheer luck, I found the handle of the door, and in the next second, I ran out onto the landing and slammed the door behind me. At almost the same moment, I heard a door opening somewhere below, and John Clifton came running upstairs, candle in hand. "What is it?" he asked. "I heard a noise and... Good heavens, there's blood on your shoulder." I stood there white as a sheet, with blood on my shoulder in the outline of a hand. "She's in there," I said, pointing to the room. My hand was shaking, and the painting is in there too, hanging on the wall. At this, he laughed. "My dear fellow, this is mere nightmare." He pushed past me and opened the door. I stood there in terror, unable to stop him, unable to move. Then there was silence. He entered the room, and the next moment he came out again and instantly shut the door. "What a foul odor," he said. "And yes, the painting is in there, and on the floor is some thing like a shroud, like what they bury people in. Come away quickly." We went downstairs as quickly as we could. Some of you will perhaps understand what happened if you remember that inexplicable affair some 8 years ago at the churchyard at West Folly. An attempt was made 3 times to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide. On each occasion, the coffin was found within a few days, again protruding from the ground. After the 3rd attempt, They buried the body elsewhere in unconsecrated ground. They buried it just beyond the iron gate of the garden belonging to the house where this woman had lived. She had committed suicide in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone. Some time later, the body was again dug up, and the coffin was found to be full of blood.